What's up, beautiful people? One of the things I hear from patients routinely is that their chronic disease or situation is solely due to genetics. And I talked about this a lot in my book when I went through my journey of looking through, well, are these genetic mutations or SNPs determinative? And the answer was some, yes, others, no. So we have evidence across many conditions that support the idea that we can moderate genetic risks by how we engage with our environment. Exercise is one such intervention that may reduce the risk of developing a disease even in the face of unfavorable genetics. This study examined the association between device measured, so it was actually a Fitbit, and they looked at moderate or vigorous physical activity and adverse cardiovascular outcomes in people with and without genetic risk of cardiomyopathy. And cardiomyopathy is basically a fancy term for heart injury or heart abnormalities, structural abnormalities in certain portions of the heart. The main analysis stratified participants into active and inactive groups, and this was based upon whether they met the WHO criteria for physical activity, which is 150 minutes a week. We've talked about that before. In the minimally adjusted analysis, inactive carriers, so people who did not meet the requirements and also carried the specified genes, had a 91% increased risk of the composite outcome of cardiovascular outcomes, compared to 36% for active carriers and 48% for inactive non-carriers. And the reference group was active non-carriers. These were attenuated to non-statistical significance in the fully adjusted analysis, which included metabolic conditions such as diabetes, hypertension, obesity, also included smoking, which suggests that these conditions act as mediators rather than confounders. So this makes sense, right? Because people who are physically inactive tend to have a higher prevalence of diabetes, hypertension, and obesity. Now, there are significant limitations. This was a small number of genetic carriers. There was a small absolute number of events, which is why you saw very large confidence intervals. So always take studies like that with a grain of salt. The outcomes were based on ICD-10 codes. Usual observational caveats apply. We need follow-up prospective studies. So for this population, this type of genetic changes, this was more hypothesis generating to lead to hopefully longer follow-up prospective studies. But there is a large amount of evidence for numerous different conditions where you look at people who have high genetic risk compared to people who don't, and you look at their behaviors, things like diet, exercise, sleep, stress mitigation, whatever. Look at certain aspects of lifestyle or socioeconomic status or whatever, and you see that it can attenuate the risk. So I think it's so important that when things run in our family or we have higher genetic risk for developing something, it doesn't mean that there's nothing we can do about it for certain genetic conditions. Now, others like sickle cell are deterministic. You have the gene, you get the disease. I'm talking about for genes that are associated with a higher risk of certain diseases. These are the things where lifestyle appears to matter, and we have the ability to lower that risk based upon how we interact with our environment.